proud that we had to move the event to the Troy Community Center because we couldn't hold everybody over at the Troy Library. So thank you all for coming out to the Community Center. We're so pleased that you're joining us for tonight's event. It's an honor for me to introduce David Maraniss, who's visiting our community as part of the Library of Michigan's 2016 Michigan Notable Books Author Tour. Every year, the Michigan Notable Books Author Program chooses 20 outstanding fiction and nonfiction books written about Michigan or by a Michigan author and published the previous calendar year. This year, several authors will visit 50 libraries throughout the state during April, May, and June. The Troy Library was fortunate to have been selected as a tour venue this year. These free presentations are brought to you by the Library of Michigan, the Michigan Department of Education, the Michigan Humanities Council, the Library of Michigan Foundation, Meyer, and the Michigan Center for the Book. The Michigan Humanities Council has asked that you fill out the survey that was placed on your chair. Please let them know if it was worthwhile for you to attend this program, and if you'd like, you can fill it out and leave it on your chair, or you can leave it on the table by the door. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce David Maraniss, an associate editor at the Washington Post, author of several best-selling books, and 3-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. David won the Pulitzer for national reporting in 1993 for his newspaper coverage of then-presidential candidate Bill Clinton. He was also part of the Washington Post team that won a 2008 Pulitzer for the newspaper's coverage of the Virginia Tech shooting, and he's won several other notable awards for achievements in journalism. His newest book, Once in a Great City, A Detroit Story, is a New York Times bestseller and was selected as a top 2015 pick by several highly respected publications, including the Washington Post and The Economist. He's also a really great dinner companion. So please welcome David Maraniss.
Well, when the Michigan Library Association asked me whether I would come to Michigan to talk about this book, my response was, I can't help but do it because of my family's association with libraries. I have 3 cousins who are librarians. An aunt and uncle were librarians. My mother was a book editor. My sister is a librarian. And my father, my late father, in his last couple of years of life, he came out of a hospital, and a visiting nurse came by and visited and said, "Elliot, I think you're feeling well enough that this week you can go to church." And my dad said, "My church is the public library." So that's what libraries mean to my family. I wasn't expecting to write a book about Detroit. I have to be obsessed with the subject matter to devote 3 or 4 years of my life to it. And this book came to me in probably the oddest of the ways that books have entered my subconscious or consciousness. I was in New York City, in Manhattan, on Super Bowl Sunday of 2011, in a bar. And here's a admission I have to make early on. I'm a Packers fan. I wrote a biography of Vince Lombardi, and I grew up my later youth in Madison, Wisconsin, at a time when the Packers and Lombardi were winning up in Green Bay. So I was fortunate enough that my book about Vince Lombardi was turned into a Broadway play. And so I was literally in a bar with the cast of the Broadway play, watching the Packers on TV play in the Super Bowl. And the actor who played Vince Lombardi was a great guy named Dan Lauria, who was the father in an old TV show called The Wonder Years, among other things. And the woman who played Marie Lombardi, who's really the star of the play, was the fabulous actress Judith Light, who went on to win 3 Tonys, starting with the nomination for that one. But in any case, we were in this bar, and it was surreal because the network had a little skit about Vince Lombardi on at halftime, and I'm standing next to the guy who was playing Vince Lombardi, Dan Lauria, and he was on TV as well. And then the next time I looked up, I saw a commercial with a freeway sign that said Detroit. And that caught my attention. And I started to watch all of these iconic images of Detroit come onto the screen. The Joe Louis Fist downtown, the wonderful Diego Rivera murals of Detroit Industries at the Detroit Institute of Arts, the sculpture, The Spirit of Detroit downtown, a black sedan driving up Woodward Avenue. I noticed rather soon that the person driving the car was the rapper Eminem. I'm a little too old to be an Eminem guy or into rap, but I am now because of that. And there was this hypnotic backbeat as the car drives up Woodward Avenue and then stops in front of the glorious Fox Theater. And Eminem gets out and walks into that theater, and there's a black gospel choir rising in song on the stage. And Eminem turns to the camera and says, "This is the Motor City. This is what we do." I choked up watching that. Literally, there were tears in my eyes when it was over. And my wonderful wife pragmatically said to me a little bit later, "Why did you fall for that? They're just selling Chryslers." And Detroit is kind of a mess. And of course she was right. But it got me thinking about why it struck me that way. And what Detroit meant to me. I was born in Detroit in 1949 in Women's Hospital. My earliest memories, my primordial memories, are of that city, of the Boblo boat, and of Hudson's department store where my mom worked during the Christmas season, of Werner's ginger ale, so strong in those days that it would clean out my nostrils before I even sipped it. A couple of more traumatic memories, including at age 6 taking a bus. We lived on Dexter. I'd take a bus down to the Fisher Y and have to swim naked with other little boys in this freezing YMCA pool. But most of the memories were wonderful. And so I started thinking about, well, what can I do if I'm touched like that? What should I do? I'm a writer. I'll write. And what do I want to write? I knew at that point that Detroit was in trouble, that it was probably on its way toward bankruptcy. But I thought other people can write that story better than I can, a financial writer. I'm a nonfiction narrative writer. I like to illuminate history and give it a veracity that makes you feel like you're there and can learn from it. And so I started thinking about what Detroit not just gave me, but gave America. And that's an enormous amount. Not just the obvious one of the automobile, but also the soundtrack of my generation, Motown. And it was also the heart of the American labor movement with United Auto Workers under Walter Reuther, and very instrumental during the 1960s in the civil rights movement. So once I came upon those 4 threads of what I wanted to write about, it took me back to a specific point in time where I could tell the narrative. And I eventually settled on an 18-month period between the fall of 1962 and the spring of 1964. A period when they were selling more cars than ever before, when the 1963 models were introduced at the 1962 Detroit Auto Show, which is to Detroit what the Academy Awards are to Los Angeles, or in my rather sick city of Washington, D.C., what the White House Correspondents' Dinner might be. So they were selling more cars than ever before. Motown was leaving on its first bus tour of the country, taking that glorious music to the nation. And civil rights and labor were right at their peak in that period. And so that's the moment that I wanted to capture. Before I started this tour, my daughter, an actress and sometimes filmmaker, said, "You know, Dad, you're way too old school. You can't just talk. You have to have some video with your presentations." So she put together some wonderful videos, and I'm going to show a couple of them tonight. The first one starts with, in 1962, with the mayor then, Jerome Kavanaugh, talking about the city as it was then. And then you'll see the city as it later and what brought me to write this book.
You are about to witness the very exciting story of a city and its people. It will be an adventure that will open new sights in familiar surroundings. It is a story of a city seeking new horizons in a resolute contest with great challenges. That city is Detroit, home of nearly 2 million people. Back in 1701, long before this land became a nation, Cadillac planted the colors of France on Detroit's shore. And thus began a rich and inspiring history which has brought Detroit to its finest hour, the today of which we are a part. Yes, Detroit is enjoying its finest hour. There is a renaissance, a rebirth in the city. There's a newness in Detroit.
A question for you. What does this city know about luxury? Huh? What does a town that's been to hell and back know about the finer things in life? Well, I'll tell you, more than most. You see, it's the hottest fires that make the hardest steel. Add hard work and conviction, and the know-how that runs generations deep in every last one of us. That's who we are. That's our story. Now, it's probably not the one you've been reading in papers, the one being written by folks who've never even been here and don't know what we're capable of. Because when it comes to luxury, it's as much about where it's from as who it's for. Now, we're from America, but this isn't New York City, or the Windy City, or Sin City, and we're certainly no one's Emerald City.
This is the Motor City, and this is what we do.
So I didn't buy a Chrysler, but I wrote a book instead. That commercial got me going. You know, when I write a book, I talk about the 4 legs of a table that I use to write the book. And the first leg of the table is to go there, wherever there is. So as soon as I came up with the idea of doing the book, my wife and I started coming to Detroit. And we would often stay at a little sort of bed and breakfast called the Inn on Ferry Street, a marvelous old restored set of mansions not far from the Detroit Institute of Arts. And also just a couple blocks away from the Walter Reuther Library, which is the second leg of my table to do the archival research. And so every morning we'd get up and walk from the Inn on Ferry Street across Woodward Avenue to the library. And I said only half jokingly that when we started doing that in 2012, I felt as though I could sit down in the middle of Woodward Avenue and read War and Peace and not get hit by a car. It was that desolate at times, especially midday. Now that has changed considerably now. If I tried to do it now, I'd get hit by the M1 or by millennials bicycling back and forth. Or there is, as I'll get to later, much more vigor in certain parts of the city now than there were when I started this book. One of the central questions I had for this book, I'm fascinated by why certain things happen in different cities at different times. Why Detroit, in that period that I write about in this book, had this creative burst of Motown. You know, why did it happen in Detroit? And one of the, some of the answers were fairly obvious to me and crucial, one being sort of the migration, the great migration of African Americans from the South coming up to the industrial cities of the North, and Detroit in particular, along with Chicago, bringing with them the oral traditions and the great church music and jazz and blues. Another was the pure entrepreneurial genius of the founder of Motown, Berry Gordy. And also, given less credit, but equally important, were Berry Gordy's older sisters, the four sisters who really were as instrumental to the founding of Motown as he was, and to its preservation. But in any case, Gordy was able to find this incredible talent that just by coincidence was in great proximity. You know, when that first bus left Detroit in October of 1962, think about what was on that bus. Little Stevie Wonder at age 12, Marvin Gaye, the great crooner, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, the Marvelettes, Mary Wells, the Temptations, great Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, and a group that was the opening act and nobody was sure if they would make it or not, called the Supremes. It was just a marvelous set of musicians that came there. And why were they all out of Detroit? Well, along with those two reasons I gave, I found two other reasons that really sort of explained it much more importantly to me. One was the geography of Detroit, this vast geographic expanse, 28 acres across, with mostly single-family homes. And into those homes went pianos, because Detroit had working-class people with enough disposable income that they could afford pianos, most of which were sold by the largest piano manufacturer and store in the country at that point, the Grinnell Brothers. So that every musician I interviewed talked about the piano in their house. And the other important reason to me, the one that had the most resonance, was public school music teachers. Detroit had great public school music in that era. And again, every artist I interviewed could remember their elementary school music teacher and their high school music teacher. You know, over the course of my career, I've interviewed 3 presidents and many famous world leaders, and I have them all on tapes in my own archive. But one of my favorite tapes was during the research for this book when I interviewed Martha Reeves, and she started describing to me the meaning of music teachers to her. She remembered her elementary school music teacher, Emily Wagstaff, and her high school music teacher, Harry Begian. And as she was talking, she said, you know, Mr. Begian taught us the fundamentals and the classics. And he really, you know, I learned opera. And she said when she was 16, she was plucked from the choir to sing an aria at the Ford Auditorium downtown. And as she's telling me that story, all of a sudden she broke into the aria at age 72 and hit the high note. And I have that on tape, which is just wonderful. So, you know, the whole story of Motown and Martha Reeves is one that's very important in the Detroit of that era. We're going to show another video starting with Martha and the Vandellas, and you'll know this is a scene that you would never see today. OSHA would not allow it.
Nowhere to run.
If you look closely, you noticed a couple of things in that, aside from the singers. One was Berry Gordy with Martin Luther King holding an album, The Great March to Freedom, The Walk to Freedom in Detroit, which is sort of the center pin of my book. Detroit was, 1963, the heart of my book, was probably the crucial year for the modern civil rights movement. And a few months before the summer, Martin Luther King and his supporters spent time in Birmingham, Alabama, trying to desegregate that city. And they were sicked upon by police dogs and billy clubs by the Bull Connor and the Birmingham police. And many of them were jailed, including King himself, who wrote one of his seminal pieces, The Letter from the Birmingham Jail there. And it was the United Auto Workers from Detroit who provided most of the money to bail those protesters out of jail in Birmingham. Walter Reuther sent one of his top aides down to Birmingham, literally with $100 bills in his belt to help get them out of jail. And that was just one small part of the way Detroit was an important part of the civil rights movement. The mayor who you saw in the first video, Jerome Kavanaugh, was elected largely because of the African American vote exerting its influence for the first time after a period of some tension between the city, particularly the police force, and the African American community. And one of his first acts was to bring a progressive police chief to Detroit named George Edwards, who actually stepped down from the Michigan State Supreme Court to take that job. And he did so with the hopes of improving race relations in a city that had a pretty difficult history going back to World War II and the riot of 1943 between largely newcoming whites and African Americans who came up for jobs in the defense industry and were fighting over jobs and housing. So by 1963, Detroit was trying to change. And at the same time, there was a very colorful preacher in Detroit named Reverend C.L. Franklin, who had a daughter whose name was Aretha, along with two other singing daughters. And in the 1950s, Reverend Franklin he was sort of the traveling preacher of America. He would fly down to some city in the South during the week and give a sermon and fill up a whole auditorium with thousands of people who came partly to hear him because his sermons were famous. They were recorded by Chess Records and he was on the radio. And so people knew his sermons like he was a rock star, and they'd call out, let's hear the eagle stirreth its nest, or different ones of his sermons. And of course, they also had the joy of listening to his daughters, especially Aretha, sing. In '63, Franklin decided he would get involved in the civil rights movement. He was not particularly beloved by most of the traditional African American Baptist preachers in Detroit. They thought he was too flamboyant and provocative, which he was in some ways, personal ways. But he had a long-standing relationship with Dr. King, and he decided after the Birmingham difficulties that he would hold a rally in Detroit. And it was on June 23rd, 1963. King came to Detroit. He was greeted at the airport by the police chief, not by police dogs or billy clubs. As a matter of fact, George Edwards said to King, you won't find any police dogs here. And nobody was sure how the event would go. There was some fear that Dr. Franklin, or Reverend Franklin, couldn't really organize it and there might be some racial problems. It turned out to be a very peaceful event. 150,000 people marched down Woodward Avenue to Cobo Hall, where Martin Luther King gave the first serious public iteration of his I Have a Dream speech. This was 2 months before it became the most famous speech of the 20th century when he did it at the March on Washington in August. but he said it in Detroit first, in June. The other aspect of that video that caught my attention was the first scene with Martha Vandellas, which was the car that they were singing in, which was the Mustang. And that Mustang is kind of the car of my book. It was being conceived in secret when my book starts in 1962 out in Dearborn by a group led by Lee Iacocca, who was then at Ford Motor Company, and would take all the credit for the Mustang, even though it was his engineers and others who actually developed it. But Iacocca was a great salesman, and including selling himself. And it was also at the same time it was being developed as a car, the advertising campaign was being developed in secret in downtown Detroit in the Buell building by the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Company, the largest advertising company in the world, whose biggest client was the Ford Motor Company. 10% of all J. Walter Thompson business came from Ford. And so they had a huge Detroit office in that era. When I was 6 years old, living on Dexter, my older brother and sister, we'd sit out on the porch of our flat and on the second floor, and they'd quiz me on the 1955 new model cars as they drove down Dexter. That's about the extent of my car knowledge. You open a hood and I don't know what's going on in there. So I didn't really try to write too much about the physical aspects of the Mustang because it's out of my realm. And also it's been written about a lot, but I was curious about the selling of the Mustang. So my wife and I went down to Durham, North Carolina, to Duke University, which happens to have the largest advertising archive in the world, including all of the papers of the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Company. And so I found all of the unwritten internal documents about the ad campaign for the Mustang. And there were two interesting things that struck me as I was looking through the J. Walter Thompson papers. The first was that originally it was going to be called the Torino. That's the name they'd settled on. Now later there would be a Ford Torino. But in 1963 and 4, as this car was being developed, there was a problem with that name, which is that Henry Ford II, the Deuce, who was the president of Ford Motor Company, the grandson of the founder, Henry Ford, was as flamboyant in his way as Reverend Franklin was, personally. And at that time, he was having an affair with an Italian jet-setting divorcee. And so some of the people at Ford thought it might not be too smart to give it an Italian name. So they looked around, they went to the library and all kinds of different things and came up with the name, the Mustang. The other thing I discovered is when they were developing that advertising campaign for the Torino, the whole motto was going to be Torino, imported from Detroit, which is the same motto that Chrysler used a half century later that in the commercial that got me interested in writing this book, imported from Detroit. The Mustang, this 1964 and a half Mustang, it was called, was introduced at the New York World's Fair. I had a personal connection to that. My dad, though he worked in Detroit later and went to the University of Michigan, grew up in New York. And so every summer we would drive back to Brooklyn, where his parents were. And in '64 we went there and went to the New York World's Fair. My strongest memory is a weird one. I stupidly went up to the Pepsi pavilion and said, "Could I have a Coca-Cola, please?" I wasn't trying to be a wise guy, I wasn't thinking. But I also remember vividly going to the Ford Wonder Rotunda. And by the way, as a 5 and 6-year-old, I vividly remember driving from Detroit to my grandparents' house in Ann Arbor and seeing the old Ford Rotunda by the side of the road, this marvelous building, whose the fire that destroyed it is the opening scene of my book. But anyway, they sort of recreated it a little bit out at the New York World's Fair, and there was a Disney-esque Futurama that they had, and I went on it. What you would ride in mostly are reconfigured 1964 and a half Mustangs. That's where it was introduced, going through this Futurama scene. Right after that was April of '64 that the Mustang was introduced. Shortly after that, Lyndon Johnson came to Detroit, and then on to Ann Arbor. Now originally, it was supposed to be John F. Kennedy, but this was the spring of '64. He was gone, assassinated in the fall of '63. Kennedy had a very strong connection to Michigan, as did most Democratic presidential candidates and presidents. It was in Detroit on Labor Day in 1960. Traditionally, a Democratic candidate for president would begin their campaign in Detroit, in Cadillac Square, with Walter Reuther at their side, and that's what Kennedy did in 1960. And in that speech, I saw that it was there that he uttered the phrase that would become the most famous phrase of his career: "Ask not what your country can do for you." He didn't use "ask not," the poetic inverse order of it, but it was the same phrase with the "ask not" at the end. So here in Detroit, you had what is regarded as perhaps the greatest speech of the 20th century in America, the "I Have a Dream" speech, and the most famous speech that Kennedy ever gave, first uttered in Detroit. Because Kennedy was gone, he had been invited to give the commencement address at the University of Michigan in 1964. He had a strong connection to the University of Michigan, too. It was there during that 1960 campaign, late at night or early in the morning, actually, when he arrived in Ann Arbor. He gave a speech, and 10,000 students came out to hear him after midnight. And it was there that he first made a proposal of what would become the Peace Corps. And after that, it was the University of Michigan and the University of Wisconsin, where I went, that provided the most young people of any schools in the country to go into the Peace Corps. So Kennedy couldn't make it, he was gone, but Lyndon Johnson was president in the spring of '64, and he arrived in Detroit on May 22nd. He was greeted at the airport by many of the figures of my book, Walter Reuther and Mayor Kavanaugh. Henry Ford II was there for the first time in his life, and the only time, endorsing a Democrat for president. He did it right at the airport. And then Johnson spoke, and he declared Detroit the herald of hope for America, the engine of this country. And then he got on a helicopter and went over to Ann Arbor and delivered the Great Society address. And that's really where my book ends. This wistful moment, Detroit at its peak. I call it a shining star that didn't realize it was a dying star. There had been one report in the spring of '63 by some sociologists at Wayne State University who predicted exactly what would happen. They said Detroit would lose 500,000 people by the end of the '60s decade and would depopulate at that rate for the foreseeable future. It was not even on the front page and was not paid attention to because Detroit was selling more cars than ever and everything was optimistic. And so Johnson could come to Detroit and declare it the herald of hope for the country. We all know what happened after that. When I finished the book and started my book tour in last fall, I could no longer read War and Peace in the middle of Woodward Avenue. I noticed a vibrance that I hadn't noticed before, both downtown and in the Cass corridor. Young people were coming. It was being called the New Brooklyn, although that's an insult to Detroit. But it actually was gaining in population for the first time in decades. Still vast swaths of Detroit desolate and people struggling to keep their homes, and the education system still unresolved, seemingly intractable problem that has to be dealt with if Detroit is to fully revive. And there are many neighborhoods that need more help. But I think that Detroit has gone from, when I started the book, sort of a symbol of a city of ruin to the symbol of a city of hope. And we're going to show one last video with a voice that you should recognize, sort of capturing that transition.
There's an old friend that I once heard say something that touched my heart, and it began this way. I was born by the river in a little tent, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. He said it's been a long time coming, but I know my change is gonna come. Oh yeah. He said it's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. I might not be if I knew what was up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know my change has got to come. Oh yeah. I went to my brother and I asked him, brother, could you help me please?
I've said that the most important word in the title of my book is the most prosaic, in. It's not once a great city or once upon a great city, but once a great city, because Detroit still can be a great city. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions, and I'll repeat them. Yes, ma'am.
Where on Dexter did you live?
I lived about a mile up from the Fisher Y from Grand River, and I went to Winterhalter Elementary School. And one of the amazing things about that is when I was on tour in the fall, literally 10 people came up to me at various times. One woman was in tears, but they all said, I was born at Women's Hospital in 1949 and I went to Winterhalter and we must have been in first grade together. They all remembered the teacher's name. I did not, I'm sorry to say, but that's, yes, sir.
Two of the great institutions in Detroit are our daily newspapers, the Free Press and the News. They're still doing great work, but they're a shadow of what they once were. As a newsman yourself, is there a bright future for our daily newspapers?
Newspapers won't exist when my grandchildren are adults. But that just means that the format will change. They won't be on paper. But what I've always said in answer to that question is that the platforms, the formats always are changing. And there's nothing that I might not like it. I will read a newspaper until I'm gone. But there's nothing I can do to stop it. And it's not the most important thing. The most important things are two things. One is that from the beginning of time, humans have understood themselves through story. And whether that story is told by a newspaper, by a book, by Instagram or Snapchat or a documentary, it's still the need to tell a story that will persist. The second aspect is more threatened and vulnerable, and that's the need for a search for truth, which we're discovering more and more is up in the air. You know, some of the new technology, even if it is neutral, is endangering that process. Everybody thinks that they're, you know, they go to narrow sources of information now instead of broad ones, looking only for things that reinforce their own beliefs, whether they're true or not. And people can sit at home in their pajamas and blog and snark and troll and all kinds of things. But you need somebody to go out and try to find the information. You know, to use those legs of the table that I try to use. You know, talk to people, find archival materials, go somewhere and understand the sociology and culture of a place. So that is endangered. I think that, you know, the Detroit newspapers do have a great history. They went through very traumatic periods, a couple of them. They're still there, which is great. It's wonderful that Detroit, unlike so many cities, still has two newspapers. And I don't know what the future is for one of them, but I'm glad they're both still around. And but I think that I think Detroit will survive. It's papers that are in cities that are a little bit smaller than that are really struggling to find why they exist. And they're becoming homogenized, owned by larger corporations, Gannett and others. And so the local flavor is almost washed out of them. And so why are they there? You know, if you can't get your local news from them and you can get better national and international news online and other places, what is the purpose of them? So I think they have to figure that out or else they're in deep trouble. Thank you.
If you ever consider writing a sequel, because I think if you came back in 10 years, you could write again a great city.
You know, I agree completely with what you said, but I have to be honest and say I probably won't write a sequel. But I'm rooting for Detroit, and I'm following it, and I'll write about it again, but probably not another book. I've got 3 books queued up to do, which will take me another 10 or 12 years. So, you know, it's possible, but it was the obsession with what Detroit gave America that drew me to this book. And so I'm not, even though I'm rooting for Detroit and think you're right that maybe in 10 years we'll be able to tell a very different story, it's not necessarily a story that I should write. But thank you for that.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about the coming back of Detroit, what your perception is. You were talking about your perception of seeing it different. I read a book by Angela Flornay, The Turner House, and I was following her tweets, and she tweeted that she'd been back in Detroit, but she was the only person of color in that part of Detroit. Do you see that Detroit's coming back still, that kind of racial divide?
Well, that's the central dilemma of Detroit historically and still. Absolutely. I think that in my, you know, I've become great friends with a fabulous woman, African-American woman who runs the Source bookstore on Cass, Janet. And I stop there every time I'm in Detroit, and she talks about what's happening in that part of Detroit. And on the one hand, she's excited about the reinvigoration. On the other hand, she's worried about who's being left behind, who's left out of this revival. And until Detroit figures out how to bring everybody along in a way that doesn't seem competitive or leaving people out, then it will not have a full recovery. But I have to say, I was, a few months ago in the winter, I was at a conference in Detroit. I spoke there, and its whole purpose was to talk about how to reinvigorate all of the neighborhoods and bring them back. And so I think there is an understanding that that's what has to be done for a true Detroit recovery. Yes, ma'am.
What is going to be the subject of your next book, and could you tell us a little bit about your customary process of writing, how you discipline yourself to write regularly?
I'm not going to talk too much about my next book. I'll say generally it's about the McCarthy era. And again, it will be a narrative with some key figures in it, some of whom will be familiar to some people in this audience. My process is that I'm completely incompetent at everything else in life. But the one thing I can't change a light bulb, but I love everything about what I do. I love the research and I love the writing. I was born lucky in that I don't get writer's block. And if I do, it's because I haven't done the research, and so I'll go out and do more. My books generally take about 3.5 years. And the first 1.5 years is exclusively the research, going to the places of the book. You know, when I did the book on Vince Lombardi, I had to turn to my wife and utter the immortal loving words, "How would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter?" Her response was, "Brr." But we did, and that made all the difference in my understanding of that one company town, not unlike Detroit in the sense, except it's football there. I can't say it's football in Detroit. Sorry. But I made it back to her by saying, "How would you like to go to Rome for my book on the Rome Olympics?" Or Kenya for my book on Barack Obama, or Puerto Rico in the winter for my book on Roberto Clemente. So Green Bay was interesting, but I don't think we'd want to spend another winter there. And so and then Detroit, of course. I told you I came here many times. And then after about 1.5 years, and I don't quite know, I can't explain where it is, but I know there's a point where I'm ready to start writing, and that's when I do. That doesn't mean I'll stop reporting. I'll keep reporting until the very last day I'm writing it, but it's usually about 1 year or 1.5 years of just writing and filling in the holes, reporting. Once I start writing, I realize what I don't have more clearly. And sometimes a book will take me in places I wasn't expecting it to go. This book, I had done a little bit of research about the Olympics. And then when I was writing it, I realized that's a key part of the story. I didn't even talk about it tonight, but Detroit was a major player in the Olympic movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they thought that they were going to get the 1968 Olympics. A decision which was made in the fall of 1963, right during the heart of my book. So once I realized how that fit in and sort of the optimism of that moment, and bringing several of the characters of my book into that movement, and some of the racial tensions that were going on at the same time that inhibited or conflicted with the attempts to get the Olympics, I went back and researched that for another month because I wanted it in the book. So when I'm writing, usually I write in silence, even though as a newspaper guy, I'm used to calamity around me. So I can write with a lot of noise. But when I'm writing a book, it's usually silent. This time, it was never silent. I was playing the entire Motown track the whole time I was writing it. I got every Motown song ever recorded, and like a 12-disc set, and played that the whole time. I usually write best in the morning, but if I'm on a roll, I'll keep going and come back and do it again at night. So that's sort of my process. Yes?
Other than winning the 68 Olympics, was there any other intervention during the period that you wrote about that might have changed Detroit's fortunes or at least mitigated some of the misfortunes?
Well, who knows what the Olympics would have done. I mean, it certainly would have been fascinating. If Detroit had gotten the 1968 Olympics, you can look at it a few different ways. One is that, you know, economists who study the Olympics in cities find that more often than not, it's a disaster for the city, or at least not a boon. And they end up spending more money and things get turned into white elephants after the Olympics are over. But who knows if in this case, if Detroit had had the Olympics in 1968, would the city's leaders have been more sensitive to some of the other problems that were bubbling up in Detroit, and 1967 might have been forced, you know, not happened in the way it did? I don't know. 1968 also was really a summer of black power. It was when Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fists in Mexico City, which did win the Olympics. And how that would have played out in Detroit with its you know, long tradition of black politics, that would have been fascinating to watch too. So I don't know how it would have gone, but other factors, you know, I think that one of the key factors was Detroit's lack of real mass transit, which is a crime. And it's almost too late now to really do it in any good way, but you know, the emphasis on freeways and not on, you know, all of the important big cities of America have mass transit, and Detroit doesn't. You know, it has that pathetic people mover, which moves nothing but a few people going to the Greektown casino, maybe. So I think that's a factor. I think that the way the freeway system was developed, really disregarding the traditional African-American neighborhoods and tearing right through them, through Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. For the book, I interviewed Reverend Hood, who died a few months ago. He was in his 90s, and he showed me a map. He had his Plymouth church was in the area near where the freeway was going, and he showed me a map that the developers had, and it showed every building except the black churches. There was no regard for them in the way that this was developed. And I think that the unwitting consequences of urban renewal were harmful to Detroit instead of helping. And I think that was a factor too. I think that the auto industry turned its back on Detroit in some ways from the city. I mean, the suburbs are thriving, but I've talked to several executives of the big three who regret what happened and say that they realized too late that the city itself had to be healthy, had to be the heart of this whole area for it to be truly a functioning place. And so they regret that. And so you see a lot of foundation money from them going back into the city now, you know, a half century later. Yes, sir.
Do you see any other urban areas doing things that we're not doing or that we should be doing or that we could learn from?
You know, I could answer that question, but it'd just be BS. I mean, I'm not an expert on, I'm not a true urbanist. So I think Detroit, every big city has problems that they share in common. Detroit is sort of an exaggeration of most of them. But I would say that Detroit, in a funny way, is lucky that it hit rock bottom because it liberated it in some sense. And so now there's more opportunity to create in the city. And it's gone through the worst. It's rising. So instead of looking to other places, people are coming to Detroit to see what Detroit is doing. There certainly are best practices that you can find in other cities. But so, you know, they have different demographics, different histories, so they're not always translatable. You know, you can't compare Portland, Oregon, with a much wider and richer demographic to Detroit. And you know, a lot of different places like that. And it just, so Detroit has, I think it now has the energy, and I know that urbanists from all over the country are fascinated by Detroit and pouring in here to not only study it, but try to help it come back. And that's about the best I can give you, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.